Joe Biden has always been a man of the center, but not the kind you think. For half a century, he has moved through the halls of American power not as a disruptor, not even as a reformer, but as something more elusive, a steward of the system itself. His story is not one of ideological commitment or grand vision. It is the story of a man who came to see the survival of institutions as the highest political good, and who made himself into a vessel for that survival, regardless of cost. He did not begin this way. His earliest years were marked by loss, fragility, and a world that seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. But over time, that sense of crisis hardened into a doctrine. He came to believe that legitimacy, once broken, could not be restored. That disorder, once unleashed, could not be recontained. That justice, however noble, was not worth pursuing if the pursuit itself risked destabilization. This is not a portrait of failure. It is something worse. A portrait of success inside a broken machine. Biden did what the system asked of him. He read its cues, internalized its fears, and acted accordingly. And in the end, when confronted with a final choice between disrupting the system to repair it or preserving the system at the cost of everything else, he chose preservation. The result was not just the failure to prevent genocide or to confront climate collapse or to lift the weight of inequality. It was the re-enthronement of Trump, the very threat Biden believed only he could forestall. This is not a cautionary tale about a man who betrayed his ideals. It is about a man who believed to the end that ideals without order were indistinguishable from ruin, and ruined his ideals in the process. In the fall of 1972, a young Joe Biden won an improbable Senate seat. He was 29 years old, barely eligible, politically unseasoned, and personally devastated. Weeks after his election, a car crash killed his wife and infant daughter and left his 2 sons badly injured. He almost quit before being sworn in. Many would have interpreted this as a sign that God had a different plan in mind for them. Not Biden. He doubled down. He stepped into the Senate at a time when America's post-war order was visibly breaking. The Vietnam War had shattered public trust. Cities were erupting in protest and fire. Assassinations had wiped out the generation of moral giants, King, Kennedy, Malcolm, Evers, whose absence left a kind of ethical vacuum. Watergate was just beginning to unravel. The national mood was not one of reform, but of disintegration. For Biden, the chaos was not theoretical. It was ambient. Loss and collapse were the twin forces shaping both his private world and the country he had just begun to serve. He did not react with fury. He reacted with fear. In those early years, he did not draw the conclusion that transformation was necessary. He drew the conclusion that collapse was always close, that institutions were more fragile than they appeared, and that the veneer of order, any order, had to be protected if anything good was to survive. This was the seed of his lifelong ethic. Not that ideals were unimportant, but that ideals alone could not hold back entropy. That governance was not a pursuit of justice, but a fortification against the return of the void. From the outset, Biden was not trying to build a new world. He was trying to keep the old one from vanishing. Biden spent the next 3 decades becoming fluent in the grammar of survival. He watched carefully who rose, who fell, and what the system rewarded. It did not reward vision, it rewarded fluency. The senators who lasted were not the loudest or the most righteous. They were the ones who mastered committee work, procedural nuance, backroom compromise. Biden learned this not in books, but through osmosis. He absorbed the codes of Senate life and slowly became part of its architecture. What faded from view over time was any remaining belief that change could come from outside. The idealists of the McGovern era, the ones who'd entered politics to shake things up, were slowly pushed out, neutralized, or assimilated. Those who refused to speak the language of process simply found themselves excluded from the conversation. Biden didn't need to be told the rules. He saw them enforced. He came to understand that real power was quiet. That disruption didn't make you dangerous, it made you irrelevant. That if you wanted to shape outcomes, you had to be invited into the room, and that the cost of entry was always the same. Stability first, everything else second. The longer he served, the deeper this lesson sank. Political maturity, as defined by the institution, was not a matter of principle. It was the shedding of it. You learned to act through the system, not against it. You learned to play the long game. You learned not to make messes you couldn't clean up, and eventually, you stopped even dreaming of change that would require a mess to begin with. By the late 1980s, Biden had become a senior figure in the Senate, chairing the Judiciary Committee and eyeing the presidency. But just as he seemed poised to rise, the fragility he'd always feared caught up with him. His 1987 presidential campaign was over almost before it began. Caught plagiarizing a speech, not once, but repeatedly, he withdrew in humiliation. The betrayal wasn't catastrophic, but the system's response was. It wasn't the sin that killed him, it was the breach. He had broken form, violated trust, and the collapse was instantaneous. The lesson landed hard. Intention meant nothing. One wrong move could erase everything. Norms were not guidelines, they were traps. Soon after, Biden presided over two of the most consequential judicial confirmation battles in modern history. Robert Bork's nomination collapsed under ideological fire. Clarence Thomas's hearings devolved into a spectacle of power, race, and gender that permanently scarred the institution. In both cases, Biden found himself not as a decisive actor, but as a figure caught in the undertow, trying to hold the center while everything around him broke apart. He emerged damaged. The Senate emerged shaken. And what remained was a belief reinforced by pain. Once order cracks, chaos does not politely wait. It pours in. From then on, Biden treated disruption not just as risky, but as inherently destabilizing. Even when it aimed at justice, even when it was righteous. Once the guardrails gave way, there was no telling what would follow. He didn't just distrust upheaval. He came to see it as an existential threat. Something to be contained at all costs, even if that meant letting rot go unchallenged, because the alternative, he believed, was worse. After the Cold War, Biden's world opens outward. No longer tethered to domestic crisis, his focus turns increasingly to America's place in the global order. Foreign policy becomes his proving ground, not because of ideology, but because it rewards what he has come to value most: discipline, fluency, and control over chaos. The 1990s confirm something he already suspects, that in complex systems, perception becomes reality. During the Clinton impeachment, he watches as moral outrage is converted into political theater, then into paralysis. The lesson isn't about right or wrong. It's about how easily process can be hijacked by signal, how quickly institutions can become stage sets for symbolic warfare. After 9/11, the stakes rise. Biden sees how rapidly fear reorganizes power. Hesitation becomes a liability. Signals, gestures, absences, delays are interpreted by adversaries as weakness. Interpretation itself becomes a kind of weapon. His 2002 vote for the Iraq War is shaped in this crucible. It's not a vote of conviction, it's a vote of signal control. He doesn't fully trust the intelligence, he doesn't seek war. But he believes that if the United States doesn't act, its credibility will collapse in ways far beyond Iraq. The risk in his mind is not just Saddam Hussein, It's the cascade that could follow if America is perceived to have blinked. This is not strategy in the conventional sense. It's preemptive containment, shaping perception to prevent destabilization. It's the logic of a man who no longer believes in linear causality, who now thinks, if you don't act, something worse might happen. And if you do act, hard, early, visibly, you might avert what you can't even see coming. By this point, Biden has fully embraced a worldview where the appearance of control matters more than the substance of outcome, where ambiguity invites risk and restraint is not moral, it's tactical. The goal is not to win, but to avoid spiraling, to delay the point at which control slips, to make sure the system doesn't interpret hesitation as collapse. And so, his instincts tighten. Speak carefully, move quietly, signal strength. Don't trigger escalation. Don't invite unpredictability. Governance in this model isn't about solving. It's about not making it worse. By the early 2000s, the voices of the left begin to stir again. The Iraq War breaks the post-9/11 consensus. A new generation of Democrats, angrier, more confrontational, and less interested in triangulation, begin to gain traction. Howard Dean surges. Anti-corporate language returns. Movements start to coalesce around climate, inequality, racial justice. But once again, Biden reads the room differently. He does not dismiss these movements, but he does not believe they will hold power. He believes, as always, that power comes not from passion, but from fluency. That translation, not intensity, determines outcomes. Barack Obama's rise confirms this instinct. Obama channels hope, but governs with caution. His campaign rides movement energy, but his administration governs through calibration. When he selects Biden as his running mate, it's not for vision, it's for ballast, for the symbolic message that change would not come at the price of control. Inside the White House, Biden watches reform work the way he always believed it did, not through rupture, but through absorption. The Affordable Care Act, Dodd-Frank, the Recovery Act, none are revolutionary, none satisfy the base, but all pass. All survive contact with the system because they're built not to provoke collapse, but to accommodate constraint. For Biden, this affirms something deep. That translation is not betrayal. It's the only path to permanence. That change, to endure, must arrive in a form the structure can metabolize. That demands without conversion are not brave. They're invisible. The lesson for him is not that movements are wrong. It's that their righteousness is irrelevant without formatting. Power doesn't reject them because they're unjust. It rejects them because they can't be read. It's not repression. It's refusal to recognize what doesn't fit. And so, Biden's belief crystallizes. If you want to change the system, you must speak its language. If you don't, the system simply looks past you. The Tea Party years are Biden's final confirmation. The Obama administration enters office in crisis, economic collapse, 2 wars, rising polarization, and soon finds itself met not by loyal opposition, but by a new kind of sabotage. The Republican Party no longer negotiates. It obstructs by design. Shutdowns, filibusters, debt-ceiling brinkmanship. These aren't tactics. They're a strategy to prove that governance can't work. And still, Biden insists on the old ways. While Obama turns inward, technocracy, executive orders, carefully stacked legislation, Biden is dispatched to the Hill. His job is not to win arguments. It's to keep the machinery barely functional, to preserve the minimum procedural space in which governance can still occur. He spends years managing tempers, holding coalitions together, keeping collapse at bay. His biggest victories are not new laws. They are the absences of disaster, the crises that didn't escalate, the deals that barely held. DACA survives as a constrained executive order. The Iran deal is written as a non-treaty to avoid Senate rejection. The ACA passes through reconciliation, bypassing the filibuster with a single vote to spare. It's government by workaround. But for Biden, it's proof of life. Through all of this, a final belief settles in. Power is not about argument, it's about position. If you are not inside the structure, you cannot act, you cannot deliver, you cannot be trusted to carry anything without breaking it. Outsiders may burn hot, but their fires consume too much oxygen. What endures is what fits, and what fits is what can pass through narrow gates, slowly, quietly, intact. By now, Biden no longer sees institutions as containers of power. He sees them as the only legitimate source of it. Ethics, to be real, must be housed in structure. Anything else is just noise. The 2016 election felt, to Biden, like the bottom falling out. He didn't run. After decades in public life, he chose to step back. Personal grief, party dynamics, timing, it all seemed to push him out of the spotlight. But when Trump won, Biden didn't see it as just a political loss. He saw it as institutional rupture. The unspoken rules, the ones that had guided his entire career, were collapsing in real time. Suddenly, truth became optional. Spectacle replaced procedure. Diplomacy was mocked. Credibility drained from every office that once held weight, and the ripple effects were everywhere. Allies questioned American commitments. Markets wobbled. Courts came under attack. Police brutality erupted into national protest. And through it all, trust in the system bled away like a slow hemorrhage. To Biden, it was all connected. Not through ideology, but through fragility. He saw what he'd always feared, that the failure of any one stabilizing force could bring down the rest. Order, prosperity, legitimacy, they weren't separate goals. They were a three-legged stool. And when one gave out, the whole thing tilted. He'd spent a lifetime managing trade-offs. Now, those trade-offs looked like moral imperatives. Hierarchies weren't just tolerated, they were necessary supports. Economic inequality was no longer framed as a moral emergency, but as a tension to be managed carefully, lest it trigger political revolt. Global alliances, even unjust ones, became binding agents in a system that felt close to fracture. In private, Biden grieved the damage. In public, he began to speak in the tones of triage. The task now was not to make things better. It was to keep them from getting worse. Not to fulfill promises, but to hold the perimeter. Not to demand clarity, but to keep the noise down long enough for the structure to breathe. Trump's election was a wake-up call that the system no longer worked for people. But Biden, he thought it was proof that his instincts had been right all along. By 2020, Biden had returned, but not as a candidate of vision. The field was filled with newer voices: Warren, Sanders, Harris, Buttigieg, each with bold plans, urgent causes, systemic critiques. He entered the race reluctantly, almost as a fallback. But as the primaries wore on, something became clear: that the appetite for transformation could be co-opted as a return to the known. What voters wanted, more than anything, was relief. Relief from chaos, from the noise, from Trump, from the feeling that the floor might give out. Biden didn't win by out-arguing anyone. He won by offering quiet. He didn't promise revolution. He promised exactly what he gave. To retrench the failed systems of power that had made him, his friends and his family rich and powerful. To reverse change. To halt the flow of change. To resist adaptation at all costs. And responding to the fear of Trump, the pandemic, racial crises and economic collapse, people began to buy in. And in his victory, every lesson he'd learned over 50 years collapsed into one governing idea. Maintain the status quo. Promise people only what they know. Crack down on anything that seems a threat. Throw money at the problems. This wasn't just lack of imagination, it was doctrine. His first year in office proved him the very incarnation of fear and anxiety. He didn't prosecute Trump's crimes because he wanted to protect the veneer of an office already soiled beyond recognition. Every policy proposal was filtered through the same lens. Can it survive the Senate? Can it avoid triggering backlash in his base? Can it be absorbed by the machine? Progressives bristled. They pushed. They demanded more. But Biden didn't flinch. He didn't want transformation. He just wanted people to forget. After 4 years of Trump, he wasn't going to test the limits of what the system could bear. He was those limits. The lesson is harsh. The system doesn't read transformation as hope. It calls it threat and tries to kill it. The first months of Biden's presidency were a blur of urgency. The American Rescue Plan passed quickly, but just barely, rammed through via budget reconciliation, dodging the filibuster with no Republican support. Infrastructure came next, a rare bipartisan success. But then the gears began to seize, Build Back Better collapsed under the weight of its own scale. Student debt relief was gutted by the courts. Climate provisions barely survived, hidden inside the renamed Inflation Reduction Act, framed more as industrial policy than existential necessity. Biden didn't rage, he adjusted. Where others saw betrayal, he saw the narrowest possible path forward. He didn't punish moderates. He didn't shame the reluctant. He stitched together just enough support to move something, anything, through the narrow corridors of a paralyzed Congress. His measure of success had changed. He didn't ask whether a policy was just. He asked whether it could pass, whether it could survive contact with the system, whether it would leave any residue at all. For him, this wasn't moral compromise. It was moral triage. He governed like a battlefield medic. Stop the bleeding, keep the patient breathing, ignore everything you don't have the tools to fix. Deliver what you can. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the functional. That ethic hardened into strategy. Coalitions weren't built on unity. They were held together by overlap, just enough agreement to move a bill, no more. And in that model, purity became not only unhelpful, but dangerous. It tore at seams, it raised expectations, it risked the very outcomes it demanded. Justice in this frame didn't vanish, it shrank. It became something provisional, something partial, something delivered in fragments, with the hope that the rest might come later, if it comes at all. By the middle of Biden's first term, the presidency had settled into a pattern, not of transformation, but of maintenance. The legislation was real: infrastructure bills, climate investments, industrial policy, expanded subsidies, debt relief. The outputs weren't imaginary, but the outcomes felt strangely non-transferable. What Biden built was not a social contract. It was a series of conditional benefits, each one tied directly to continued participation in and dependence on the institutional system he governed. Student loan forgiveness, not structural reform, but executive grace, delivered by his signature and vanishable with his absence. Broadband expansion, useful, but filtered through private contractors, federal grants and supply chains with no durable democratic control. Green energy subsidies, not guarantees. Tax credits, not universal rights. The message wasn't, "You deserve this." The message was, "You get this as long as I'm here to keep the faucet running." Every policy was embedded in a logic of association. It pointed not outward to new horizons, but backward to the institution itself. What mattered was not how much lives were changed, but whether those changes could be linked to the system in charge. Roads, energy projects, job programs, each framed as part of a national effort to repair something rather than remake it. The social imagination wasn't expanded. It was reinscribed over and over into the framework of federal continuity. And the justification was never rooted in the felt needs of the public, it was rooted in institutional memory. This bridge needs repair because it's part of our legacy. This policy is good because it was built the right way. These benefits matter because they prove government still works, if you trust it, if you participate, if you comply. But no one believed it, because the lived experience didn't match the premise. Young people still saw no future. Renters still couldn't buy homes. Workers still had no power. And yet the policies kept arriving, fragmented, complex, and layered with conditions. Means tested, time limited, paperwork bound. You could get help, yes, but only if you knew how to ask, only if you qualified, only if you stayed inside the machine. And this was the deeper design. Association, in Biden's hands, became dependency. Not in the pejorative sense, but in the institutional one. You would be helped, but only through channels the system controlled. Your relief would be real, but only temporary. You could benefit, but never become independent of the system offering the benefit. It was governance as social reinforcement. Help was not guaranteed. It was renewed, updated, maintained. You would be attached to programs that required constant resupply, and that resupply could only come from a system strong enough to deliver it. And Biden, caretaker of the system, asked to be judged not by how free he made people, but by how reliably he could keep them tethered. Policy became associative reinforcement, and the more it accumulated, the less it transformed, because the lived experience didn't match the premise. Young people still saw no future. The effect was not empowerment, it was entanglement. And when the system failed, in Gaza, in housing, in basic legitimacy, people began to ask, was anything here ever meant to last? The presidency might have limped along indefinitely in association mode, policies accumulating without resonance, benefits delivered without loyalty, a public loosely tethered to a system it no longer trusted. That equilibrium could have held, but history intervened. First Ukraine, then Gaza. Ukraine arrived as a test Biden knew how to pass. Russia's invasion presented a familiar frame: alliances, deterrence, credibility, the post-war order under threat. Here, his instincts aligned perfectly with elite consensus. Aid flowed, NATO solidified. The narrative was clean: democracy versus authoritarianism, order versus chaos. And crucially, Ukraine allowed Biden to integrate moral language with institutional power. Support for Ukraine did not require disruption of the system. It required its mobilization. Defense contractors, diplomatic channels, appropriations, alliance management. The machine hummed. This was preservation as virtue, rendered coherent. Ukraine validated him. It proved in his mind that history still worked the way he understood it. Institutions could act morally as long as morality aligned with stability. That lesson mattered because it set the trap. Then Gaza broke the model. Gaza demanded the same moral clarity, but produced the opposite institutional incentives. The alliance structure pointed one way, the images pointed another. International law, humanitarian norms, public opinion, youth movements, global protests, all converged on a single demand: stop this. And alas, Biden could not bring himself to even try. Not because he didn't see it, not because he didn't understand the cost, but because Gaza required a rupture, not a modulation. There was no associative policy here, no conditional benefit, no executive workaround that could split the difference. A ceasefire meant confrontation. Arms restrictions meant leverage. Leverage meant destabilizing an alliance Biden had spent his life defending. And destabilization, to him, meant collapse. So he integrated. Ukraine and Gaza together forced the final synthesis of his worldview. The system must be defended even when it is wrong, because there is nothing outside it capable of bearing the load. The alliance structure was no longer a means, it became the end. Moral judgment was subsumed into strategic necessity. This was not hypocrisy, it was coherence. He spoke of humanitarian pauses while approving bomb shipments. He expressed concern while vetoing accountability. He mourned civilian deaths while ensuring the flow of weapons never slowed. The contradiction was not accidental. It was the logical outcome of a life spent prioritizing institutional continuity over moral resolution. And this time, the public noticed. Because unlike infrastructure grants or tax credits, Gaza was not abstract. It was visible, immediate, irreversible. No amount of associative framing could soften it. No language of process could obscure it. The images broke through every filter. What people saw was not complexity, it was commitment to the wrong thing. The collapse was swift. Youth support evaporated. Progressive legitimacy imploded. Protest followed him everywhere. Campaign staff quit. Donors hesitated. Allies defected. Polls cratered in every state that mattered. Not because people misunderstood him, but because they finally understood him clearly. He had no moral center outside the system, and so, when the moment came to reassess, to step aside, to force a reckoning, to allow a reset, he did what integration demanded. He stayed, because stepping aside would have admitted the system was wrong. And that was the one conclusion he could never accept. By the time he withdrew, 2 weeks before the convention, it was already over. The party was hollowed out, the base demoralized, the successor crushed, the losses total. Ukraine had proven the system could still act sometimes. Gaza proved what it would do when morality threatened structure. Together, they sealed his legacy. Joe Biden did not fail because events overwhelmed him. He failed because when events demanded choice, he chose the system every time. And in doing so, he revealed the final truth of his presidency. A politics built entirely on preservation cannot survive the moment. Preservation itself becomes the crime. That is the integration. That is the end of the path. In the book of Revelation, the end does not begin with chaos. It begins with structure. A beast rises from the sea, heavy with crowns, teeth like a lion, bearing the marks of every empire that came before. It is not new. It is the old power, dressed in continuity. Its strength is not only in force, but in the memory it carries. This is how the world works. But the people do not worship it at first. They need someone to explain why they should. And so a second beast rises, not monstrous, but familiar. It looks like a lamb. It speaks like a dragon. It performs signs, offers meaning, gives the first beast a voice. It makes power appear righteous. It makes order appear sacred. It says, this is necessary. This is moral. This is peace. And the people believe, not because they are weak, but because they are tired, because they want the system to mean something, because they want to believe the sacrifices are worth it. That second beast is not evil in appearance. It is persuasive. It speaks the language of restoration, of national healing, of return to norms. Its greatest crime is not violence, but credibility. It convinces the world to give in just a little longer. And that's what ends it. This is not allegory. This is the present. Trump rose first, railing against the system, testing its limits, breaking norms. The institutions strained, but held. He was resisted. He was limited. not by virtue, but by the last flickers of constraint. Then Biden came, not as the dragon, but the lamb, the one who said the system could be good again, who wrapped its decaying form in careful words and temporary programs, who said, "I can fix this without breaking it. Trust me." And for a while, people did. But then came Gaza, and the mask dissolved. The same system that claimed to protect the innocent became the sponsor of mass death. And the man who had promised to speak softly spoke not at all, or worse, he justified. He made the machine sound moral, even as it consumed the helpless. That is the voice of the second beast, not roaring, explaining. And by the time the public saw it, it was too late. Because now Trump returns. But not as the same man. He doesn't need to break the system. Biden already broke belief in it. There are no constraints left to invoke, no norms to appeal to, no institutions that the people still feel bound to protect. And Trump sees that. He no longer acts as if the system limits him. He now acts as if he is right to ignore it. And that's the moment Revelation describes. The second beast hands power to the first. The people, disillusioned, bow, not because they were deceived, but because they have stopped believing that resistance will lead anywhere better. They take the mark, not under threat, but under exhaustion. A mark not on the body, but on the imagination. This is the cycle. It is not prophecy, it is memory. Written in Scripture because we need to recognize it when it begins again. And now we are living it, not as metaphor, but as structure, not as prediction, but as pattern. This was the cost of Biden's governance by continuity. He made obedience feel like complicity. And in doing so, he handed Trump not just power, but the right to rule without limits, not as fable, but as fact. And he handed him the method as well, offering order, stability, restoration, the same cycle, just with different oppressors. So what beast will come next, should we believe again too late? For remember, the beast was never just the demagogue. The beast was the system hollowed of meaning, and the silence that followed when the last voice defending it chose survival over truth. Now the voice is gone, and what comes next no longer needs to speak. So did you catch it? In all that, did you see Joe Biden's fatal mistake? Even Hunter almost figured it out. It's that when God takes everything from you, you don't double down. You open yourself to His guidance. You don't try to control the world. You are just supposed to paint. But people always fuck that up.